Hey, this is Judah from SceneForge Studio, and this video is going to talk about the improvements, bug fixes, and changes that are going to be in 0.1.8 of SceneForge, which should be available by the time you're watching this video. So I'm going to get started by talking about some of the fixes or improvements. So first and foremost, on the left-hand side, we have the Visuals tab. Now previously, it was kind of annoying to scroll through because there was like a weird elastic scroll like feeling to it, which sometimes ended up basically like messing with the wrong slider, which wasn't ideal. So now it's much more rigid. You won't accidentally mess things up, and it only becomes scrollable as you open up these tabs. So for example, if I were to close them all up, because there's nothing off screen, we don't need to scroll, and therefore you won't accidentally mess anything up. Additionally, the scroll bar is now nice and easy to see, nice and pink, and you can drag it very easily because it's on the right side. Same goes for the hierarchy, which also previously was having some scrolling issues. Now it's exactly the same. It only shows up when you actually need it. So for example, if I bring in this and I duplicate it a bunch of times, you see it eventually shows up and now we can scroll through. Something that also is kind of hard to see because I just added a bunch of the same object, but if I take this and I duplicate it, you'll see that new objects appear at the top of the list as opposed to the bottom. This just makes it so much easier to find new stuff in your scene, especially when you have a lot. So that's some UI improvements. Another cool thing that we did is change the editor camera. Now this might be in the next release, I'm not quite sure, but I still want to show it off just because it's cool and fun, and it's a worthwhile improvement. Previously, the editor camera was very choppy and very like start and stop. It's very rigid, but now the movement with the arrow keys, or WASD, is smoothed out a little bit. So it just feels like you're actually flying through as opposed to harshly moving through different parts of your scene. I don't know. It's a preference thing. I like it, and I think most people will too. Next, a big bug fix was that previously some of your storyboard frames would appear invisible, so they were just unusable because they would be invisible here, and if you tried to add one, they would be invisible down here as well. Obviously, that is problematic, but now it's fully fixed, so you can see all of your storyboard frames exactly as they should. So it's a good fix. There's not much of a problem there anymore. The other thing we did is added this little 3D button at the top. Now what this does is it allows you to switch between the regular 3D editor view and a locked top-down perspective. Now this is not technically true 2D, but you are locked to a two-dimensional plane. You're only moving on the X and Z axis, or from your perspective, X and Y axis of your computer monitor. So what this is, it basically allows you to just view things from a bird's eye view, or like a top-down. Kind of reminds me of like a Dungeons and Dragons map or like a board game. For some things, it might not be useful, but sometimes adjusting the lighting or parts of your scene, it is useful to have a top-down view. So now you can adjust everything as you're viewing the scene from the top down. It's another way of editing your scenes, which of course you don't have to use. So those are the main improvements and fixes, but now I want to talk about something that is not going to be in this release, but hopefully will be in the next release because it is a major improvement, and that is dynamic range. Now what dynamic range is, essentially, is the amount of information in an image that allows you to show either a higher or lower number of colors and brightnesses in different areas. So I have this reference image that I think explains it pretty well. These are both the same photo, but taken at a original, so it's either SDR or LDR, standard or low, depending on who you ask, and then high dynamic range. So again, it's the same picture, but you can see the one on the right has so much more detail, and it captured so much more variance in lighting. So the brightest parts of this image are very different from the brightest parts of this image. You can get so much more color and tone in the HDR image because it's a high dynamic range. So some cameras, some older cameras don't support this, some older monitors don't support this, so it's an improvement that you can see across all forms of media, video games, or visual media, I should say, video games, movies, and when it's available, it looks really great. So the problem comes where if I make the scene darker so we can actually see this, and we have our light over here that I'm going to bring to the other side of the room. This editor camera is a high dynamic range camera, and so you see here, if I select the light and I can adjust the bloom, if I can find the bloom setting, here it is, the actual haze of the bloom will match the color of the light. And as I adjust the light, the bloom will adjust itself too. And as I adjust the intensity of the light, or the brightness in lumens, the bloom will adjust as well. It's not a fixed value. This slider is like a intensity multiplier on that bloom effect, but the bloom will still be affected by the brightness. Same with the temperature and color of the light. This is because we have access to high dynamic range in our picture. The problem is the virtual cameras in the scene do not. So this is the viewfinder of the virtual camera over here. It's currently seeing through the wall. I'll bring it in so we can actually see it. And I'll adjust the focal length so it's a little wider. So you can see here, right, this image should be much more blown out. But of course it is not. Now we did some math to kind of simulate the similarity and consistency. So if I adjust the bloom, it is very similar, but you'll notice that the second I make this light much warmer, even though the virtual camera does see the light on the scene, you can see we do have that orange light, the actual light itself, the light object, is not updating the color and bloom. So in a low dynamic range situation like the virtual camera, the actual bloom and the effect of the bloom is locked to just a plain white value. Same with the intensity. If I make the light basically like off, the bloom is still very much in effect, even though the light is basically non-existent anymore. Another example is if I move this all the way down, you'll see the virtual camera just can't even display bloom of this color, while the regular HDR image can. So because of the kind of tricks we did to kind of make sure they seem consistent, in some cases it might not matter. Like if you dial this into the exact center and so they are about the same brightness and color, yeah, it's probably going to look pretty much the same. But the second you start making stuff a little more interesting, that's when you the illusion kind of breaks. So if you kind of adjust your scene correctly, then it won't matter. But in most cases, for people who are taking this stuff seriously and really want to use this in a production environment, having access to that high dynamic range is incredibly important. Now, of course, you definitely should play around with tone mapping to kind of keep things more consistent, and having a tone mapping will help this inconsistency. But regardless, it is something that needs to be addressed, so it's something we're working on. It's actually a limitation of the video and image capture system we're using, so hopefully by the next release, it's going to be completely overhauled, so the images you see in the viewfinders will be fully one-to-one to the exact same dynamic range as the editor camera, as well as all exports coming out of the software. An example of this is that if you go to Storyboard Mode, and go over here to this scene, if anyone watched the last video where I actually built this scene, you'll probably remember, or you can look back, that the scene was much brighter than what you see here, because when editing it, we had a high dynamic range. But of course, when we took the image, we did not have that. So the final output is much darker, more muted, and it is a look. We have like a dark, moody look with the windows and everything, and it looks good, but it's not quite that accurate HDR image that we're going for. So in the next release, it should be fixed. It's just something that should be understood in its current state. And so with that, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. Oh, there's one more thing I forgot before I go. I'll talk about this. Really quickly, we added a reflection intensity multiplier slider. All that does allow you to control the reflection intensity, which makes it easier to troubleshoot lighting problems because of reflections. So if I go to the sky settings, I'll do this really quickly. You can see here right now global reflections are off, but if I increase it to 1, now we are at standard. And if I increase it to 2, we get an extra bright or extra intense reflection. It's a personal preference, but if you see if I go to nighttime, here we have a weird bug where it is way too exposed, so you have to decrease it to something a little more reasonable, and then have it update the reflection from there. So it's really something to mess around with to get your reflections to be more accurate. It's a personal preference thing, but it's an improvement that'll just make things more consistent. And so with that, thank you very much for watching. I hope that cleared up some things, and hopefully that fixed some bugs that were bothering you. All right, thanks.